The wind howled low through the scrubland like a whisper from the grave. Dry and restless, it carried with it the scent of scorched earth, dead grass, and something strange, something that didn't belong. Ezekiel Zeke Cain straightened from the split fence post he'd been trying to mend near the creek that ran dry every third summer. His sweat-soaked shirt clung to his back like a second skin, and the sun, damn that merciless Texas sun, pressed down on his shoulders like the weight of judgment itself. This stretch of land between Amarillo and what folks called nowhere was the kind of place that could make a man forget time, forget kindness, forget his own name if he stayed too long. Zeke had been here longer than most, but that day, something felt off. The birds had gone quiet, as if the sky had forgotten how to sing. No chirps, no buzz of flies. Even his old mule, tied to the corral post, seemed unnerved ears twitching, eyes too wide, as if listening to something Zeke couldn't hear. That's when he saw the figure. At first, it didn't look like much, just a smudge of movement in the shimmer of heat over the horizon. Could have been a coyote, maybe a lost calf, or just the sun playing tricks on a tired man's eyes. But as it stumbled closer, wobbling with no rhythm, no purpose, he realized it was human. Zeke's heart beat louder than it should have. His hand instinctively drifted toward the old revolver holstered at his side. You didn't last long out here without caution. Bandits, deserters, and worse things moved through these hills. But when the figure finally emerged from the haze, Zeke froze. It was a child, a girl, no more than 8, maybe 9, barefoot and limping, her feet blackened by dirt and God knows what else. Her dress, what was left of it, hung from her tiny frame in tatters, stitched with strange patterns, old beads, and leather that marked her clearly as Comanche. His grip tightened around the revolver. That wasn't just a child. That was a message. Relations between settlers and the Comanche had always teetered on the edge of violence. Treaties came and went like desert rain sudden, rare, and never enough. Every rancher Zeke knew would have already drawn, aimed, and fired without a word. But Zeke wasn't like them. Maybe that's why he still lived alone. He slowly stepped forward, keeping his hands visible, moving the way you might approach a skittish horse that's been kicked too many times. The girl saw him but didn't flinch, just kept dragging her tiny frame forward, her eyes wide and too dark, her lips cracked and trembling. She tried to speak. The words came fast and frantic in Comanche. Zeke didn't understand a single one, but he didn't need to. Her hands moved to her mouth, then pointed to the creek behind him. She was starving, dehydrated, desperate, and there it was again, that feeling, like the sky had dropped a veil over the land. Zeke swallowed hard and looked around. Still nothing, just wind and silence and the sun bearing down like judgment. He thought about his neighbors, what they'd say if they saw this, what they'd do. There were whispers in town just last week, raids, ambushes, someone's barn torched near Lubbock. Every settler was on edge, and now a Comanche child shows up on his land. The smart thing would have been to walk away, leave her there, let nature finish the job and keep his head attached to his shoulders. But something in those eyes wouldn't let him. Zeke crouched down, reached out slow, then scooped the girl into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, like bones wrapped in sunburnt skin, and trembled against him, either from hunger or fear. He carried her back to his cabin, footsteps crunching across brittle dirt and gravel, every step echoing louder in the silence. The moment he stepped inside, a chill ran through him. The room wasn't cold hell, it was sweltering, but something about the air felt thick, like the walls themselves were watching. He set her gently on the only chair he owned and moved quick to the stove. There was stew left from the night before, barely enough for one, and a crust of bread. He ladled what he could into a chipped bowl and placed it in front of her. She didn't hesitate, just dove in, fingers shaking, eyes wide with something that looked like hope. And as she ate, Zeke watched and wondered what in God's name he'd just done. He turned back to grab a cloth, and that's when he saw it. Her necklace, partially hidden by the rags she wore, glinted in the dim light. Beads, bones, stones, and a center pendant, etched with a symbol he recognized from an old tale told in town by a trader who'd barely escaped a Comanche camp. That wasn't just any trinket. It was a ceremonial mark of Chief Ironclad's bloodline. Zeke's stomach dropped. He looked at the girl again closely now, the proud shape of her nose, the quiet strength in her brow, the distinct markings on the leather fringe across her chest. Oh, hell. This wasn't just a Comanche child. This was the child. Zeke stood frozen, stew spoon still in hand. The girl looked up at him, her mouth full, eyes still too big for her face, and all he could think was that 200 war-painted warriors could already be riding through the dust, following her trail right to his front door. He glanced out the window. Nothing but emptiness, yet the air still held that eerie hush. The girl kept eating, slower now, more careful. She looked at him, really looked, and in her gaze was something ancient, like she'd seen more than any child should, and something in her eyes said she understood, not the words, but the danger. She finished, licked the bowl, then curled in on herself in the chair and closed her eyes. As sleep claimed her, Zeke pulled a blanket from his own bed, draped it over her tiny frame, and stepped back. He stared at her for a long while. Out there, somewhere, someone was looking for her, someone powerful, someone who wouldn't ask questions before cutting his throat. And yet, he didn't regret it, not yet. But that night, as the wind howled again through the hollows and coyotes refused to sing, Zeke couldn't help but shiver, not from the cold, but from the weight of the storm he knew was coming. Twilight crept through the slats of Zeke Cain's cabin like a silent intruder. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floor, wrapping the walls in dim, uneasy hues. Outside, the last birds had gone still. Inside, time felt suspended, like the land itself was holding its breath. Zeke stood in the middle of his one-room shelter, staring at the girl asleep in his chair. Her breathing had softened, but every so often her fingers twitched as if haunted by the memory of her ordeal. She was still wrapped in his old blanket, dwarfed by it, looking more like a ghost than a child. And then his eyes dropped again to the necklace. He hadn't meant to notice it, but the way the light hit those beads, it was like fate had pointed a finger. The necklace had been mostly hidden beneath the shredded fabric of her tunic, but when she'd shifted in her sleep, it slipped into full view. His stomach clenched. The beadwork was unlike anything he'd ever seen up close, woven with painstaking precision. The colors vibrant despite the dust and wear. In the center hung a carved bone talisman, etched with the symbol Zeke had only heard described in hushed voices. the talon of a thunderbird. Pete Morrison, Old Pete, as the town called him, had described it just a week ago over a poker game, after one too many swigs of rye. That there's the mark of Ironclad's blood. He'd slurred, voice dropping low. Ain't just a trinket. Cain. It's sacred, worn only by the chief's kin. You see that on someone, you're either looking at royalty or trouble. Zeke swallowed hard, heart suddenly pounding in his throat. Royalty. The realization landed heavy, like a bullet in his gut. This wasn't just a lost child. She was someone important, protected, dangerous by blood alone, and he'd brought her into his home, fed her, covered her with his blanket. Out here, that could be mistaken for possession, or worse, abduction. Zeke backed away from her, suddenly unsure of what he'd done. His hands were dirty, stained with splinters and sweat, but they trembled like he'd just touched a live wire. He stared down at his palms, willing them to steady. "What the hell have I done?" he muttered aloud. The girl stirred slightly, her brow furrowing, a soft whimper slipping past her cracked lips. Zeke's first instinct was to reach out, to comfort her, but he pulled back. The necklace burned in his mind like a brand. 20, maybe 30 miles away. Chief Ironclad might already be on the move. If she meant that much to the tribe, they wouldn't wait long. Hell, they could already be on his trail, tracking the girl's footprints, the broken grass, the disturbed dirt where she collapsed. He moved to the window, peering out over the empty expanse of prairie. The landscape was still, too still, and in the silence, every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Zeke's mind raced through possibilities, but none ended well. He couldn't bring her into town. Half the folks there wouldn't hesitate to brand him a traitor just for letting her past his fence line. And if he tried to return her himself, he pictured riding up to a Comanche camp at dusk, holding their chief's daughter in his arms. That's how a man gets filled with arrows. And yet, leaving her here was worse, if the tribe found her in his care. With no explanation but good intentions and leftover stew, they'd see what they wanted to see. Zeke turned back toward the girl. She looked so small in his oversized chair, her face gaunt, smudged with dirt and pain, a child. And yet, because of who she was, so much more. He remembered the way she'd reached for the food, how she hadn't spoken a word of English, how she'd curled up in sleep without fear. Somewhere in her tiny, wounded frame, she must have recognized something in him, something safe. And now, her safety could cost him everything. The weight of it pressed down on his chest like a millstone. He hadn't asked for this. He didn't want to be part of any damn conflict. All he wanted was to be left alone with his land, his cattle, his ghosts. But life on the frontier didn't care what a man wanted. It just came at you raw and unpredictable, sometimes with drought, sometimes with bandits, and sometimes with a starving child wrapped in sacred beads. Zeke sat down slowly at the edge of his bed, rubbing his temples. He thought of his own boy Daniel, who'd died 3 years ago during the fever outbreak. Just about her age, maybe younger. That same fragile build, that same quiet desperation in the eyes during the final days. He'd been powerless to save his own child. And now, maybe he'd been given a second chance to do right by someone else's. But what then? What if this act of mercy ended in blood? He looked toward the girl again. Her breathing had grown deeper now, more peaceful. The room was dark, save for the last embers in the stove. He could barely see her, but her presence filled the cabin like a storm cloud. No good deed goes unpunished. He'd heard that more than once in town. Usually from men who knew the cost of stepping outside the lines drawn by history, by fear, by vengeance, and yet he couldn't turn her out. That part was settled. Whatever came, whatever judgment waited beyond the hills, Zeke Cain would face it. Because sometimes a man doesn't get to choose the shape of his trials, but he does get to choose what kind of man he wants to be when they arrive. He stepped over to the window, and looked once more into the stillness of the night. Somewhere out there, the storm was gathering, and it was coming for him. The sky was bruised purple when the sound of distant hooves shattered the uneasy quiet. Zeke Cain stepped out onto his porch, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Though he hadn't yet decided whether it was for show or survival, the wind had shifted. There was urgency in the air, the kind that prickled the skin and made animals bolt before a storm. He saw them before he heard them, 3 riders, cutting through the dust with haste that spoke louder than words. Jed Mulligan led the pack, his shaggy gray beard tangled in the wind, his face red from either heat or fury, maybe both. Behind him, Tommy Granger, the deputy from town, rode with his eyes scanning every inch of Zeke's land. The last man, Reverend Silas Boone, gripped the reins like he was hanging on to God himself. They didn't dismount. "Zeke, you damned fool," Jed barked before his horse had even stopped. "Tell me it ain't true." Zeke didn't reply. He didn't have to. The way he stood, the way his eyes flicked toward the cabin behind him, it answered everything. Reverend Boone slid down first, removing his hat. His voice was quieter but carried weight. We saw the smoke from the hills, signaling Morse or Comanche. We don't know, but it was a warning. Tommy nodded grimly. Words out. "Zeke, Chief Ironclad's daughter vanished 3 days ago during a hunting party." Storm rolled in and scattered the group. They've been searching since sunup yesterday. Now every man with a trigger finger and Amarillo's readying for war. Jed leaned forward in his saddle, pointing a thick finger at Zeke. "If she's here, if you brought her in, you've doomed us all." "She's inside," Zeke said quietly. A silence fell like a hammer. "I couldn't leave her to die." He added. Jed spat into the dust. "That ain't the point. You're holding the only child of the most dangerous man west of the Pecos. That ain't kindness. It's suicide." Zeke didn't flinch. "I didn't take her. She came, barely walking, starving. She'd have died out there." Reverend Boone stepped closer. "And I believe you. Son, Lord help me. I do. But the tribe won't care. Not in the dark. Not when all they've ever seen from us is bullets and broken promises." Tommy pulled gently on his reins, already backing his horse. "I gotta report this. You know that. But I'll give you a head start. Get her back before they find you, or this place turns to ash." In the dark, Zeke scoffed. "She can't walk a mile, let alone 20. You expect me to stroll into a Comanche camp like I'm bringing flowers?" Tommy's face hardened. "It's your problem now. With that." He turned and rode. Jed and the Reverend lingered for a moment longer. Jed muttering curses under his breath. Boone offering a final, "God help you," before they too vanished into the dusk. Zeke stood alone again, but it didn't feel like solitude anymore. He walked back into the cabin. The girl, Lulu, was awake, sitting up now, her eyes wide with something more than hunger. She'd heard the voices, maybe even understood some of them. She pointed to the window, then toward her chest, her hands fluttering nervously. Her lips moved with quiet urgency, Comanche words tumbling out like prayers. Zeke crouched beside her. "I don't understand you," he said gently, "but I know they're coming." The girl nodded. Then she pointed to the floor, lifted her hands, and began counting fingers opening and closing. 5, 10, 15. She didn't stop until she'd shown him 20 sets of 10. 200. Zeke's breath caught. 200 warriors. He staggered to his feet, heart pounding. That wasn't a search party. That was an army. A moment later, the drums began. Soft at first, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, then louder, deliberate, a rhythm older than the ranches, older than Texas itself. It echoed across the plains, threading through the bones of the land. Zeke ran to the door, flung it open. The horizon was alive with motion figures emerging from the hills, their silhouettes framed by the dying sun. Horses, feathers, lances, like a river of ghosts riding out of legend. The war party had arrived. He slammed the door shut, bolted it, though he knew it wouldn't matter. Not against 200 Comanche warriors armed to the teeth and burning with rage. Inside the cabin, Lulu was trembling, not with fear, but with urgency. She grabbed Zeke's sleeve, dragged him toward the window, and gestured rapidly. Her hands mimed Eden, sleeping, then pointed to him and touched her heart. "She's trying to tell me something," Zeke whispered. The drums stopped. A stillness deeper than silence settled over the land. Outside, hooves crunched the earth in precise formation. Zeke peeked through the shutter. They were here. 200 warriors arranged in a perfect semicircle around his cabin. War paint gleamed under the moonlight. Every man held a weapon. Every eye was fixed on him. At the center sat a figure larger than the rest, tall, broad, silver streaks in his dark hair, eyes that burned like fire trapped in stone. Chief Ironclad. A voice rang out low, accented but clear. "White man, we know you have taken something of ours. Send her out, and perhaps you will live to see morning." Zeke's hands trembled. He turned to Lulu. "Is that your father?" he asked. She nodded once, solemn. Zeke's heart pounded in his ears. He had fed her, sheltered her, protected her, but now he had to prove it. And out there stood 200 men who didn't want proof. They wanted justice. Zeke Cain had never felt so small in his life. He stood just inside the door of his cabin, staring out through a narrow crack in the wooden frame. Outside, 200 Comanche warriors sat mounted in perfect silence, their horses shifting beneath them with an eerie synchronicity. The moonlight glinted off painted faces, sharpened steel, and polished obsidian. Every one of them was staring at him. And then came the voice again, calm but firm, edged with the weight of generations white man. "Send out the girl, now." Zeke's throat went dry. The girl, Lulu, stood behind him, clutching the edge of his shirt. Her hands trembled, but her eyes burned with something deeper than fear, urgency. She began to speak rapidly in Comanche, pointing at herself, then at him, then miming a sweeping motion toward the door. Zeke knelt beside her. "You want to go out there?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They're not here to talk, little one. They're here to make an example." But she didn't back down. She shook her head and tapped her chest hard. Then she pointed to Zeke and drew her thumb across her throat. Zeke understood. If she walked out alone, they might think he hurt her. If she stayed, they might assume he was hiding her. Either way, it would end badly. But if he went with her, showed them he wasn't afraid, maybe, just maybe, they'd hear him out. He stood, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The moment he stepped outside, the circle tensed, weapons shifted, arrows were notched, spears angled downward, ready to strike. Zeke raised both hands high, palms open, rifle left behind inside the cabin. Lulu followed at his side, her small frame moving with surprising steadiness. They walked together toward the center of the circle, toward the figure that could only be Chief Ironclad. He was massive. His horse seemed almost too small beneath him, though it stood perfectly still. Like it knew it carried more than a man, it carried a verdict. The chief's eyes locked onto Zeke with an intensity that felt like fire peeling away flesh. When they stopped just outside the ring of warriors, he dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate, like a blade being unsheathed. "You fed her," he said, his voice deep and flawless in English. "You gave her shelter." Zeke nodded. "She would have died. I couldn't let that happen." Ironclad studied him. "You knew who she was, I suspected." Zeke admitted, "When I saw the necklace, and still you did not return her." "She was too weak," Zeke said, more confident now. "She couldn't walk, let alone ride. I planned to bring her to you myself." At sunrise, Ironclad stepped forward until he was only a few feet from Zeke, close enough that Zeke could see the battle scars across the chief's chest lines like old rivers cut into dark skin. Marks of war. Marks of loss. Or perhaps, Ironclad said, his voice suddenly colder, "You thought to trade her, ransom her back to us, for land, or cattle, or peace." Zeke's heart pounded. "I wanted nothing," he replied, "only to help." The silence that followed was heavy. Warriors behind the chief shifted in their saddles. The tension was a living thing now, thick as smoke, sharp as a drawn blade. Then Zeke did something he hadn't planned. He reached slowly into his coat pocket. Every warrior tensed and pulled out a small strip of cloth. Torn, stained, and clinging to a piece of barbed wire. He held it out with shaking hands. "She was wearing this," he said. "It caught on my fence. I kept it. Figured someone might need to know where she came from." Ironclad took the cloth without a word. Studied it. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Zeke seized the moment. "She came to my creek," he said, voice rising slightly. "I didn't chase her off. I didn't grab her. I picked her up because she couldn't stand any more. I fed her, gave her my last bowl of stew. She slept in my chair. I covered her with my own blanket. I asked for nothing in return. Still no reply." Then Lulu stepped forward. She grabbed her father's hand, this towering war chief, and began speaking in a rush of Comanche. Her voice quivered, but she didn't stop. She pointed back at the cabin, mimed eating, sleeping. Then she touched her own chest and pointed at Zeke. Ironclad watched her carefully. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture softened just slightly. He looked at Zeke. "She says, you have lost children. 2. Zeke's breath hitched. "My son," he said, "Daniel. Fever took him 3 years back." Ironclad nodded once, slowly, then turned to the warriors behind him and raised a hand. Every man lowered their weapon. The silence that followed was louder than any war cry. "She tells me you did not harm her," Ironclad said that you showed kindness, that you did not treat her as an enemy. I didn't. Zeke said, she's just a child. Ironclad looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, the problem is not what I believe. The problem is, they came for blood. He gestured to the circle of warriors, their faces still tight with suspicion, with rage held barely in check. They must return with justice. If not, they will take it. Zeke looked around, 200 eyes, watching, judging, waiting, and in that moment, he understood feeding the girl had been the easy part. Now he had to survive what came after. Dark Elk dismounted. His face was a storm of fury, brows carved deep, lips curled in disgust, and his voice boomed in a stream of angry Comanche that Zeke didn't understand but didn't need to. The man's gestures spoke volumes, pointing at Zeke, slicing the air, driving his spear's butt into the dirt hard enough to make the earth flinch. Chief Ironclad stood still as stone, but Zeke saw it, the tight jaw, the slight shift of weight. This wasn't just tension, this was a challenge. Some of the younger warriors began to move, splitting subtly into two camps, those behind their chief and those aligning with Dark Elk. Lulu felt it too. She stepped forward, one tiny child, between two giants, one armed with tradition and rage, the other with years of leadership and war behind him, and in the middle, a girl with no sword, no shield, only truth. She began to speak, not in screams, not in anger, but steady, clear, in Comanche, her native tongue. Her voice was small, but the moment she spoke, the camp fell quiet. She told them about the storm that tore her from her hunting party, the days she wandered alone with no food, no water, and the cold nights she thought she'd never wake from. She pointed at Zeke. She mimed collapsing. She mimed being lifted, fed, wrapped in warmth. Then she placed her hand over her heart and held it out to the tribe. Dark Elk scowled but didn't interrupt. She continued now louder, her face alight with memory. She gestured toward the cabin, toward the bowl where she'd eaten, toward the chair she'd slept in, then to the photo on the table, the one of Zeke's family. Chief Ironclad translated aloud for Zeke. She says, she saw the sadness in your eyes, the same sadness she felt when she thought she would die alone. Zeke didn't move. He couldn't. Lulu walked up to Dark Elk now, unshaken. She stood before the warrior who wanted blood and asked him something in Comanche. He replied sharply. But her answer hit him like a blow. She shouted it now, voice cracking, then she pointed at him, at herself, at the horses, at the sky, then at Zeke. She asked if he has children. Ironclad murmured. She asked what he would want a stranger to do, if his child was lost and starving. Dark Elk looked like someone had punched the wind from his chest. His spear lowered slightly, but Lulu wasn't done. She turned to the entire war party, her arms outstretched. She shouted words full of fire and pain. She wept, but not from fear, from conviction. Ironclad's voice echoed in translation. She says that punishing mercy would make us no different than the soldiers who kill without question. That if we strike down the man who helped her, then we become the monsters we claim to fight. No one spoke. 200 warriors, silent before a child. Zeke felt his own eyes sting. Then, from the back of the circle, someone dropped their weapon into the dirt, then another, and another. Dark Elk remained frozen. Lulu stepped forward, leaned her forehead against his chest, and whispered something. Zeke didn't hear the words, but when she stepped away, Dark Elk lowered his head and said nothing more. Ironclad turned to Zeke. "My daughter has done what warriors could not. She has given us reason to pause." He looked to the others, but now the council must decide, not just me. Zeke knew what that meant. The real test had only just begun. The ride to the Comanche village felt like moving through a dream, one stitched with shadows, firelight, and the muffled drumbeat of destiny. Zeke Cain sat atop a borrowed pony, surrounded not by captors but an honor escort. Yet every hoofbeat echoed with tension. He wasn't free, not yet. He was being taken deeper into a world that had every right to hate his kind. The village came into view half hidden in the rocks, cloaked in firelight and low murmurs. Shapes moved among the tents. Children stared from behind their mothers' legs. Warriors stood like statues. No one spoke to him. At the heart of the camp sat 7 elders around a sacred fire. Zeke dismounted, heart hammering. Lulu stood beside him, her chin lifted, her eyes unwavering. Chief Ironclad spoke first, recounting Zeke's act. He made no embellishments, no pleas, just facts. Then came Dark Elk, though changed by Lulu's words. He still stood and argued that justice must be traditional, that letting a white man go free risked their pride. Zeke stood in the middle, unable to understand the rapid Comanche exchange. All he could do was hold his ground and trust that the truth, however small, might still mean something. Then Lulu stepped forward again. This time her voice was soft, but it carried. 10 minutes she spoke, 10 minutes of unbroken belief. When she finished, one elder, old as the stones, hair like snow, asked a single question. She answered instantly. Ironclad turned to Zeke. He asked, "Would you save another Comanche child?" Knowing the risk, Zeke didn't hesitate. Yes. The elders conferred, whispers in the smoke. Then the white-haired man rose. Ironclad's translation came slowly. "The spirits sent us a test, not of war, but a mercy. You pass, you return, with protection." Zeke exhaled for the first time in hours, but the elder added one thing more. "You must promise, if any of our people ever come to your land wounded, hungry, lost, you will not turn them away." Zeke nodded, voice tight. "I promise." And that night, as firelight danced between 2 worlds, a promise became the bridge neither tribe nor settler ever thought could exist. Dawn crept slowly over the Texas plains, casting golden fingers across the earth like blessings from the sky. Zeke Cain rode at the center of a Comanche honor guard, no longer an outcast or a target, but something else, something harder to name. His ranch came into view on the horizon. It looked the same, fence posts still leaning. Dust still clinging to the porch, but everything felt different. The land had watched him leave as one man and return as another. Beside him, Lulu rode a small chestnut pony. Her eyes sparkled beneath the rising sun. She wasn't clinging to him anymore. She was leading. When they reached his cabin, the warriors saluted silently, then melted back into the morning fog like ghosts returning to myth. Chief Ironclad was the last to speak. "You kept your word," he said, "so will we." And then he left, leaving Zeke and the girl alone alive, free and changed. Days passed, then weeks, and stories began to spread. how a Comanche war party had ridden through the hills and returned without drawing blood, how a rancher with no family had found a daughter in the dust, how a child had silenced an army with truth. Zeke's land became a strange sort of legend, neutral ground. Warriors passed through it without arrows nocked. Settlers came to trade, not to threaten. He didn't ask for it, but he honored it. Every year, on the anniversary of that long night, Lulu returned not a starving child now, but a woman grown, strong and wise. They would sit together beneath the cottonwood tree, share a meal, and speak little, because some stories don't need retelling, just remembering. Zeke Cain lived to be 73. He died in his sleep, under the same roof where he'd once offered a bowl of stew to a girl who'd changed everything, and on his grave, marked not by a cross but by 2 sets of footprints carved in stone. The Comanche etched only 4 words: he fed the future. If this tale of an old rancher, a lost child, and a moment of mercy stirred something deep in your soul, then subscribe to the channel, because stories like this still matter, because sometimes one act of kindness can silence 200 spears, and because the frontier still has more legends, more truths wrapped in dust and fire waiting to be heard. Subscribe now, and don't miss the next time a simple man changes the course of history, one heartbeat at a time.